Today we're talking with Chris Raymond, who's Chief Sustainability Officer at Boeing. Thank you for spending some time with me at the Dubai Air Show.
Yeah, thank you, Addison.
So there's all this talk about sustainability, and the impression that I have is that when all this sustainability became a thing in the last several months, Boeing was the most honest upfront to talk about SAF first. A lot of other people, we don't have to name names, but they went down hydrogen, they're making all kinds of promises. SAF is your Boeing's approach, right?
It is, but it's not we have to view all those technologies as having a place potentially in this. So I think the one thing about the sustainability discussion is you can't assume there's one silver bullet and we're going to get to 2030, 2040 or 2050 and find it and all of a sudden it's going to be fixed. I think this whole topic of sustainability, and I like to say, really the industry has competed on fuel efficiency since its inception. And so, fuel efficiency equals carbon emission reduction. And so I think that's the good news, is the industry's been focused on that and advanced that a lot over decades. We can debate what the actual statistic is, but there's no question that if you get on an airplane today, it is so much more fuel efficient, maybe 50% more than the airplane you would have gotten on 25 years ago. So that's good that the industry's always focused on fuel efficiency, because especially now when we're all focused on carbon emission reduction. But I don't think it's going to be one thing. And, I'll share my point of view on our sustainable aerospace view, but we do need to be investing in things like electric and hydrogen and seeing if they have a role to play. We just think that will take some time. And the best thing we all agree that we could do for the industry right now is have newer fuel efficient airplanes, continue to work on operational efficiency like air traffic management, and scale up sustainable aviation fuel, because we're going to need a lot of it no matter what you believe about future applications of electric or hydrogen.
Interesting thing that I picked up from somebody at Pratt & Whitney in Boston, that this man had as an airline customer who said to him that if all the SAF in the world were made available to this airline today, all of that SAF they could only fly for one day.
Yeah, that may be true. It's in the millions of gallons that we can make today. The good news, I think, is the demand signal is now in the billions. I think, before, if you went back a few years ago, you might not have seen that demand signal. Now the demand signal is approaching, I think, 10 billion gallons. If you look at all the airline, offtake agreements or things they're putting in place. So I view that as a good thing, that the demand signal's there. But there's no question, it's a minuscule amount that's produced today, and we've got to scale that up.
And it's 4 times the price of fossil fuel.
I've heard that. I think that'll bear itself out over time, but it is more expensive in the beginning. And the analogies that we often hear the most are things like solar or wind, when they also were viewed as much more expensive. I almost would rewind the tape and go record some of the conversations that were probably occurring about solar energy, 15, 20 years ago. And so I think there's an analogy there that we can learn from on what it's going to take to scale it up. And this is where I think this kind of government-private partnerships come in. We need the enabling policy so that the businesses and the banks and the financing mechanisms can flow capital to this industry, industrialize it, and scale it up, much like it's been done with solar and wind.
Right. Your major competitors has made a commitment to hydrogen, which I think is very brave. But when speaking to them away from the crowd, so to speak, there's this talk about, well, it's one of the solutions we're focusing on, and we have to start with SAF. Do you also view these? You mentioned earlier that there are options that one has to look at. One of the things that I found fascinating is that hydrogen, up to a certain power level, and we're talking about turboprops here, you can use a fuel cell. But once you get beyond a certain size, you actually have to burn hydrogen. So it seems to me that if we have this timeline and everybody's wanting to be on the right side of history, how does this industry cope with this? This is a monumental shock to the system.
I've been in aerospace my whole career. I'm 35 years at Boeing now, and one thing I've seen about anything that scales in our business is you have to be able to technologically kind of prove it out. And the ecosystem of startups and entrepreneurs and big companies and research organizations and academia, those all help you with the technology innovation at the front. But then you have to do the second thing that's really important in this industry, and that's to figure out how we're going to safely certify it for air. And that's different than road or maritime. If the fuel doesn't work out on the road, you pull off to the side and stop your car and call somebody. You can't do those things in aviation. And so the safe certification of things, and then the infrastructure piece of that, and then the market adoption or economic model that lets that scale up. And the thing about SAF is everybody kind of generally believes we figured out the first three. We know how to produce it, at least with some pathways. There's many more we're going to figure out over time. We know how to certify it or qualify it. There's a process for that. 7 pathways have already been qualified. And then we think there's not a lot of infrastructure change that has to occur around that. And that's why the industry, I think, resonates with that. And now what we're talking about is what you mentioned. How do we scale this up? How do we solve the economic, the view of the green premium? And so I think that's actually a good problem to have. That means we've kind of found our way through these first 3. So when it comes to electric and hydrogen, I think it's too early to tell. My only thought on that is they may have a place, but we've got to get through all those buckets and figure that out. So that will take time. And so anyway, we should all want more green hydrogen in the world. That would mean there's an abundance of renewable electricity in the world to produce green hydrogen. So we should all want more green hydrogen in the world. And whether that's best used on airplanes as a gaseous or liquid fuel and propulsion system, or best used on fuel cells, or best used as a feedstock for a sustainable aviation fuel.
Right.
I think time will tell on that. We need to be looking at all that. But our view was just the thing that can help us with carbon emission reduction the fastest is if we could scale SAFs and get them to drop in.
Chris, one of the things that as I listen to people in this industry speak about this path, and of course it's murky. There's a lot of, fog ahead of us. It seems to me that, as you'd mentioned earlier, the fuel burn per passenger has dropped dramatically throughout the history of the industry, particularly, let's say, in the last 20 years, dramatically, with high bypass engines, the likes of that we see today. And at the show, for example, your 777X flew today, and at the show, everybody around me was awestruck with how quiet it is. I flew here on a 777. This wasn't the same kind of airplane. This is light years ahead. Are we ever going to be able to maintain the price point of commercial flight going forward?
Well, for a passenger? I think, the industry's done a good job at making that very available to people. In fact, I think it's what's fueled the growth of aviation. If you think about the GDP rise in a lot of parts of the world, I think we like to say approximately 80% of the people in the world have never taken a flight. So when you think about the potential market and the demand for air travel, it looks to be pretty rosy. I think we were growing at 4 or 5% a year, but we've got to do that more sustainably going forward. And I think time will tell whether the costs of the transition, including maybe the premium on SAF, how does that fall to the bottom line in a way that actually affects demand. And I think that's what everybody's worried about. That's the sensitivity, is do these technologies we need change the price of flying to the point where it affects demand? And I think it's way too early to tell on that. And,
Okay.
And the demand right now certainly doesn't seem like it's abating. And I think the airlines deserve a lot of credit for the programs they've put in place. If you wanted to offset your flight, you have a mechanism to do that with the airlines now. And each airline might have a slightly different program. But that was a smart thing that I think they did, because they will see the sentiment of consumer behavior if it starts to change. And so, I'm sure over time, the people that are willing to do that may ratchet up, or maybe they don't. I think that will give them a good indicator of when, the behavior might be changing around that. And that's very important for that stakeholder community. I think the other stakeholder communities around all of us in aviation have their own expectations about how fast, that is going to change. And, we have a value at Boeing called earned stakeholder trust and preference. And I think, what we saw is that the different stakeholders of a company, whether they're the financial ones or the government regulators or your employees or your suppliers, these stakeholders have expectations around this issue that are all changing, and they're all seeking to try to do something about it or evaluate companies around it. We have to be paying attention to all of that, and then we have to figure out what does that mean when we bring it inside the company and drive changes in a company. And driving change is hard. It's always easier to criticize it and sit on the sideline until it's proven, and then you can say, oh yeah, I knew that was going to work, or conversely say, I knew that wasn't going to work. And I don't think anybody that works in aerospace had everything all figured out when they started. It's why we design things, we test things. They take years in some cases to come to market fruition, and but this industry solves big problems, and this is a big problem we've got to solve for the next few decades of aviation.
Right. Do you think that I use the word virtue signaling quite often in conversations with people? Do you think that's a bit harsh?
Virtue signaling?
That everybody talking about greening of aviation and making it sustainable, and is that a bit harsh to say that it's virtue signaling?
I don't think it's harsh if people aren't really taking actions. I think I would hope that people, before they use that term, they actually go find out what the industry, whatever the industry is, aviation or otherwise, is doing. And I think in a former event that I was at, Richard Quest actually pointed kind of the finger at the industry and said, you all need to be speaking about the societal benefits and what you are doing outside of your industry with some of those other stakeholders that may have a view of aerospace. And then I had a personal example, when we were in Glasgow, not for the climate conference, but the month before, we had Eco Demonstrator up there. And one of the mainline media members, after she had moderated a couple of days of panels and things like that and met a lot of people, at the end she said, I had no idea all that was going on in aerospace. That was sort of an aha moment for me. It was sort of Richard Quest's words rang in my ear and said, right, we've got to be making sure we're talking to all of our stakeholders about, recognizing the benefits we have, but also making sure we don't take for granted they understand those benefits or they know what the industry is doing to lower carbon emissions.
My last item I wanted to ask you was, based on where we are today, knowing that it's a sliding thing, what do you think the timeline is between now and 2030, that what we might expect 2040 and 2050?
I think by 2030, we need to be seeing SAF scaling up, in more than one continent, I think as we get out, and I think we'll also start to see some prototype airplanes, urban mobility, electric airplanes. Maybe we'll certainly see more prototypes. We may even see some of those reach a certification level. But I go back to my 4 buckets, Addison, and I think about, okay, technologically, we've solved these electric flying machines for urban air mobility. We're starting to solve the safe certification problems. But how do we deal with the infrastructure when there could be hundreds or thousands of them? What has to happen to the air traffic management system? Where are we all going to get aboard these things? Are they going to come to my front yard? Do we have to go to the bus stop or the train stop? And I think there's just things that have to be figured out. They'll be figured out, but they have to be figured out over time. And so I think we will see an advance in some of the smaller electric vehicle. I think we'll see some advances in SAF pathways. And I think we'll learn more about things like hydrogen, about where it can or should be applied, or maybe it shouldn't be applied at all. We've flown now 5 different airplanes on some form of hydrogen. We've flown 4 of them on hydrogen fuel cells of one type or another. We flew one on liquid hydrogen. We've flown them on gaseous hydrogen. We have a space program, so we deal with hydrogen all the time. It's just, we have to solve the 4 things I mentioned. And so we learned a lot from every one of those flights using hydrogen in whatever form we chose to use it. And we've got to apply that now going forward.
Thank you so much.